which is right along the shore. The first thing that they do is they reduce wave energy. And these are, we're talking about the waves out in the lake. The plants growing in the lake, or the aquatic plants, actually help soak up and break down some of that energy so that by the time those waves hit the shore, they don't have the energy and the impact that they would otherwise if there were no plants there. So here you've got an example of some submergent plants, floating leaf plants, and emergent plants. And you can see how as these waves come towards the shore and are hitting the different types of plants, that it just kind of knocks the energy out. And I know this is just a drawing, but as you can see in this slide, it happens in real life too. If you look out into the lake here, you can see that there's whitecaps on the water. And I don't know how, maybe it's a little too bright in here, but hopefully you can see here, near the shore, it's relatively calm. And this is one of the types of plants that help break up those wave energies, the wave energy, and reduce it. So that very little impact is happening right along this shore. In this case, though, too, I want to point out that there is an area that people can still, enjoy the near shore area, as well having access in and out of the lake. So it's not like we're taking away the access to the lake necessarily, but it's helping to protect the investment, to help protect the environment by having wave breaks and natural wave breaks. When we remove native plants, a couple things can happen. So in areas where plants have been removed from the bank and you have changing levels either like of a lake or a river, basically you could get this undercutting and then slumping. So this is an area, this picture here shows an area where the bank had been undercut and the soil had been removed, and then pretty much the bank fell over. So this was at one time up higher. And so that's one of the problems that can happen. Those shallow roots can hold the bank in place, especially with fluctuating lake levels or river levels. We can also have wave action coming from upland or over the surface. That's the runoff we were talking about. And then you can get the type of erosion that's happening here. These are rills erosion that's happening and bringing the sand down into the lake. And then again, eventually these will cave in too, and so you'll have bank failure that way as well. So the thing about using plants is that we want to look at the rooting characteristics. The roots are what basically we're focusing on here, is to hold those banks in place. If you take a look at here, that the trees have large anchor type roots. Shrubs have larger roots too, but not as big as trees usually. And they go quite deep. And then there's sedges and grasses have more massive types roots. There's a lot more mass involved. And then typical fescues and bluegrasses, the types of plants we grow for lawn in our state, typically have shallower roots. The other thing I wanted to point out here about trees is they also have little tiny roots that will grow right along the surface. And sometimes those roots are the ones that really help collect water. So as water is falling from the sky, rain is falling from the sky, all of these different root systems are absorbing the water as it's being absorbed into the soil. The roots are absorbing them as well. And then they're brought back up through the plants and redistributed into the atmosphere. So that's one way of helping to reduce that volume, as well as holding the bank in place with the different type of root structures. You can see here that if this were the bank, that there's not, and the waves were coming up on this side, that there wouldn't be much right here underneath these roots to hold that bank in place. Or if you go back a step or two, you can see that having more deep roots and different types of root structures will all work together to help hold the bank in place. And that's why it's good to have a diversity of plants. Typically, I try to encourage people to use different types of plants to help hold the banks in place. Some of the hard hitters, though, are if you're having bank erosion, I like to use a lot of different types of grasses and sedges along with some shrubs and possibly some trees as well. One of the things about the trees, too, is they don't, as you can see, tree roots, there's not like a lot of roots going into the soil here. There's basically these big anchor trees, or anchor roots, I meant to say. And if you were to remove, or if you have just a tree on a bank without any other plant materials, and the topsoil is eroding, basically what you can do is that's when you've seen the trees start to fall into the lakes. People will say, why are my trees falling over? Well, one of the things is, a possibility would be is if they don't have other type of plant materials there, these roots, if you had another grass, let's say, or a sedge, can help hold these roots in place. They work together. And then the last thing is that the roots, okay, I just lost my train of thought. The roots basically, oh, I know what it was. The other thing is if you rake off the pine needles, for example, in pine trees, a lot of times people will do that, and they're exposing the soil too. And I encourage people not to rake the pine needles. That's one of my favorite mantras, is don't rake the needles. It's because those needles, that layer of vegetation, of dead vegetation, helps to protect the soil. And having that soil in place and that even the dead vegetation helps to hold those roots, because if you remove the soil, you're going to expose these roots. And then again, you can have trees falling over. So what we're talking about in shoreland plants is using native plants are 3 different areas. We have aquatic plants, and I mentioned the types of aquatic plants we have before, submergent, emergent, and floating leaf. And those help buffer the bank from wave action. Then we have the wet transition area kind of in here. It's not black and white, it's sort of a gray area. A lot of times this is the area where it's squishy to walk on, or it's not any fun to mow because it's so squishy and hard to mow. That's what we call the wet meadow area, wet transition area, wet mesic area. And those are the roots. Those are those massive roots, massy roots I should say, that hold the bank in place. And then upland plants help slow water runoff from the land. So the water, the rain hitting the shore, if you have upland plants here, that vegetation, the above ground vegetation, is going to help slow down the runoff from happening, as well as allow for infiltration to happen. The one thing I want to point out here very quickly, I point out in every talk I do, that you need to be aware that there are is what we call the ordinary high water level, and there's jurisdictions and ordinances about what we can do above and below that. So the basic thing you need to know here is there's a point on every lake that has a state jurisdiction that through the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources that extends lakeward. And so, for example, your average water level might be low down here someplace. At one time, maybe this was your ordinary high water level. Maybe you've had record high flooding up here. But anyway, there is a location called the ordinary high water level that anything below that, if you're going to add plants, you need to have a permit. Anything above that is depends on, it could be your county water plan, your county soil and water conservation district, your municipality, your watershed district, township board. They can have jurisdiction in the area above that. So, and that's important, and above this, in particular in moving soil. They want to know about it. And it varies from place to place how much you can move. And so this is one thing, I'm not going to go into great depth about this, but this is one thing I just want you to be aware of, that you need to be aware of what the rules are.